Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained Podcast. This is the podcast that breaks down complex geopolitical events of the past, present, and potential futures into small, digestible chunks. My name is Dylan, and this has been recorded on the 10th of May, 2024. Now, it's been a while. It's been about a month since I've released an episode. I went on a camping trip at a time when a podcast episode would usually come out. And so here we are a month later. So I've decided that this episode needs to be something big. It needs to be an interesting topic, a deep topic that we can dive into. Now, at the end of 2023, starting in October, I wrote a series on the Israel-Palestine historic conflict and the current Israel-Hamas conflict that we're seeing. It's been a while since I've provided an update on the conflict that's currently occurring, and also for anybody who missed when I was writing that series, I've decided that an update on the historic Israel-Palestine conflict and the current Israel-Hamas conflict would be appreciated. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Usually, when it comes to these episodes, the best place to begin is the start. When it comes to this entire situation, especially the historic Israel-Palestine conflict, the first big question is, where do you start? I think people can choose certain start points in history that best support the narrative that they want to follow. So, with that in mind, I'm going to aim to cover as far back as possible, starting with the religious connotations for both Jews and Muslims, and why both the Israelis and the Palestinians have historical claims to the territory upon which this conflict is occurring. Now, from the Jewish point of view, they first arrived in the territory where modern-day Israel and Palestine sit after the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in ancient Egypt. This was led by Moses after the 10 plagues were released as divine punishment on Egypt, and Moses and his followers travelled through the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. This was around the same time as Moses parting the Red Sea, receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, other events. So, after this 40 years, they finally settled in the land of Canaan, which is where modern-day Israel and Palestine is situated. In Judaism, Jerusalem is considered the holiest city. There will be more on this later. Now, when it comes to Islam, the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. Now, all this occurred quite a long time ago, millennia ago, in fact. But for those who wish to start the history from this point, I think the main question that emerges from it is whether the war today is a religious war. If you base this history as the start of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, is that still a religious war today? Or has the field of war changed between Israel and Palestine? If it's not a religious war, what kind of war is it? The next potential starting point for the Israel-Palestine conflict occurs towards the end of the 19th century. Now, the Ottoman Empire still existed around this time, which I've recently been writing quite a bit about as a part of my series on the history of the Balkans. You can find that over on Substack at Geopolitics Explained for anybody who's interested. At the end of the 19th century, the British and the Ottomans started buying territory in Palestine with the intention of this territory being used to build Jewish communities. Now, this occurred in the background for quite a while, but World War I threw a spanner in the works. The Ottomans made a move for the Suez Canal, and because the British were the leading empire of the world at that point, they wanted the Suez to remain under their control. So at this point, the British started to support Zionism and the establishment of a Jewish state. Now, at the end of World War I, the Ottomans lost. A few years later, their territory was partitioned. This led to several policies and declarations, including the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the British. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was an agreement between the British and the French that would split the Ottoman Empire between themselves if the Ottomans were to lose World War I. This secret treaty was created in 1916, but when the Ottomans lost World War I, it eventually ended up becoming a reality. The Balfour Declaration was the public statement from the British government that occurred in 1917 and detailed that the British supported the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. So, after World War I, and due to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Palestine was under British influence. This continued until the late 1940s, marked by events such as the Palestinian Civil War and the establishment of the State of Israel. This is another period that could be considered the start of the Israel-Palestine conflict. In 1947, the British were still in Palestine under the British mandate, but they were incredibly weakened after World War II, and they weren't particularly in a position to exact any influence over any areas of the world. With this came the UN resolution in November 1947 that recommended the adoption of a partition plan for Palestine, which included the establishment of the State of Israel. After this agreement, the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine clashed, and the British, who were there to maintain order, were planning how to get out of the region. After the State of Israel was established, we saw this transfer into a wider regional conflict. Arab states, Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq, and Syria, invaded what had been mandatory Palestine, under the British mandate and started attacking Israeli forces and Jewish settlements. This conflict became known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Now, I think this is the closest to present day that, in my opinion, you can mark the historic Israel-Palestine conflict as starting. There has been many other chapters in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, including the 1956 Suez Crisis, the 1967 Six-Day War, the 1973 Yom Kippur, the 1982 Lebanon War, the First Intifada, and the Second Intifada. That all occurred before Hamas came into power. And I think that's part of the story that started with the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. Now, if you want more information on any of these conflicts, all these conflicts I wrote about in my series on the historic Israel-Palestine conflict, which you can find on my Substack at Geopolitics Explained. The link will be in the episode description. From all these examples of conflict throughout history, a question that pops into my mind is, do both sides truly want peace? It seems to me that both sides are always vying to try and get more from negotiations, especially if it's a direct interaction with the other side. There are many examples of other mediators pursuing peace between Israel and Palestine. We've got the Oslo Accords in 1993 and 1995. We've got the Camp David meeting in 2000. We've got the Taba Summit in 2001. The Roadmap for Peace between 2002 and 2003. And then 3 separate pursuits by the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, 2007, and 2017. Now, as I said, it always seems like both sides are vying for more in negotiations. This has seemingly changed, especially with the change in power dynamics, and this occurred when Hamas emerged as a political/terrorist organisation in the Gaza Strip. So Hamas won the Palestinian legislative election in 2006 and were asked to create a unity government with Fatah, which is another political party in Palestine. Now, this government collapsed in 2007 when violent conflict between Fatah and Hamas emerged. This saw Hamas take control of the Gaza Strip, and Fatah then began to rule in the West Bank. In 2014, both sides once again tried to create a unity government. This lasted less than a year and seemingly was just an attempt by Hamas to try to gain more power in the West Bank. Since Hamas has risen to power, there have been 4 conflicts between Hamas and Israel. The first was Operation Cast Lead, which was an operation from the Israelis where they launched raids into Deir al-Balah to destroy a tunnel that Hamas used, and they killed 6 Hamas gunmen. Hamas responded with rockets. Israel once again responded, but this time with a ground invasion. This ground invasion lasted 15 days, at which point the IDF claimed a unilateral ceasefire and they withdrew 3 days later. During this conflict, Israel made it around halfway through the Gaza Strip on its ground invasion, but they stopped after 15 days. I think this conflict could be used as context for the current war, and it leads me to ask the question, Israel stopped in 2008 to 2009 during this conflict, so why aren't they stopping now? In 2012, another Israeli operation was Operation Pillar of Defense. Over 100 rockets were sent from the Gaza Strip by Hamas into Israel in a 24-hour period. This saw Israel respond with rockets of its own, but a ceasefire was mediated by Egypt a week later. So this was a shorter conflict than some of the others that we've seen in the history of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. In 2014, we saw the Israelis launch Operation Protective Edge when Hamas kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli teenagers from the West Bank. In response, Israel arrested 350 Palestinians, a large amount of which were deemed active Hamas militants. Again, Hamas responded with a rocket fire into Israel. They stated that they did this because they wanted the Israeli blockade of Gaza lifted. Israel again responded with rockets and airstrikes before conducting another ground invasion of Gaza. They destroyed 32 Hamas tunnels and then withdrew once again. This conflict lasted 7 weeks. Now, there is a conflict that occurred in 2021 between Israel and Hamas, which lasted 2 weeks. But after this, we arrive at the present-day conflict, the 2023 Israel-Hamas conflict that started on October 7th last year. At first, I was going to record this entire podcast on Israel in one episode. I've decided against that because I'm already close to 20 minutes and we're still discussing the past and the history of these conflicts and the state of Israel. So I've decided that I'll limit this episode to discussing just that, the past and the history. Next week, we'll come back and discuss the present-day situation between Israel and Hamas and the state of Palestine. We'll discuss Iran's involvement and Iran's proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and events in the Syrian civil war. We also have the Houthi rebels that I also recorded an episode on a few months ago. They were heavily involved in this conflict. We'll also discuss the Israeli internal political system and the moves that leader Netanyahu has been making to make changes to the judicial system. So, come back next week if you want more on this topic. This has been the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Firstly, I want to thank you all for listening. If you wish to follow the podcast on the podcast listening platform of your choice, I'd greatly appreciate that. You could also give it a rating if you feel so obliged. If you want more, you can head over to Substack and search Geopolitics Explained. We do a lot of writing over there. You'll be able to find the work I mentioned earlier that I did a few months ago on the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Israel-Hamas conflict. All those links are down below. I've been Dylan. Until next time, signing off.